Hi, good morning. Welcome to a webinar hosted by the Fine Arts Museum San Francisco. For those of you who don't know me or haven't seen me for a while, I'm Karen Huang, the Senior Director of Individual and Major Giving for the De Young and Legion of Honor. A short while ago, I couldn't even imagine us being connecting like this, but I'm really grateful for the forum and the technology to make this happen. And I'm thrilled that you've chosen to join us this morning. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from the Fine Arts Museum Director and CEO, Thomas Campbell, exploring first a little bit about the history of the museum on the special occasion of the 125th anniversary of the De Young. He will address trends and challenges facing museums in the past decade, and in particular, the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on our institution and the broader arts community. Lastly, he will speak about what the future of the museum might hold as we begin to plan for reopening. His presentation will last for about 40 minutes, after which I would join him for Q&A for about 10 minutes. And thank you for everyone who submitted questions in advance.
Thank you.
And now all guests' cameras and microphones are turned off throughout the webinar. But if you have any technical issues, please contact Claire Seifert, whose contact information was shared in the events detail email that was sent yesterday, and she will definitely help you. Now I'm pleased to introduce Thomas Campbell, who joined the Fine Arts Museum as Director and CEO in November 2018. Prior to coming to San Francisco, Tom, most recently a Getty Rothschild Fellow with residencies at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles and at Watson Manor in the UK, undertaking independent study of the impact of global changes on museums and cultural life. Now, as many of you know, from 2009 to 2017, he served as Director and CEO of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, having joined the Met as a curator in 1995 in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts, focusing on textile arts. Over his 30-year career, Tom has dedicated his life to the preservation, study, and promotion of art as a gateway to human understanding. A distinguished art historian, he was educated at Oxford and the Courtauld Institute in London. So now with that, I turn it over to Tom to start his presentation.
All right, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be talking to you in this albeit unusual format. Thank you for joining us, leading donors and supporters. I think we're also joined by a number of staff this morning, so welcome to you as well. As Karen said, I'm planning to take a moment to talk here about the history of the De Young and of the Legion of Honor, and to then look at some of the kind of external factors that are pressuring the museum world before COVID-19 came along to do its bit as well. And I'll finish in the last part of the talk by musing a little bit about the future of the museums. But let me start with images of, are we getting images here, Sharon? What am I seeing here? That's what, okay, here we go. So as I came to my office this morning, I walked through the empty galleries and below the banner for the Frida Kahlo exhibition that we had just finished installing as the shelter-in-place order went into effect. It was, of course, a bitter moment because this is a beautiful exhibition and I can't wait to open it when we are able to allow the public back into the galleries. But for now, the exhibition looks like this. The light-sensitive works are covered with paper, and it's like something in a fairy tale, waiting to be reawoken in the future. But while we wait for that reawakening, let's look back. Let's tell the story of the De Young and its sister institution, the Legion of Honor. The two have a strange link that, in fact, predates the foundation of both. Adolf Spreckels, the husband of Alma de Spreckels, who was the founder of the Legion. I'll click forward in a moment.
Sorry, my bad.
That's okay. Adolf Spreckels, the husband of Alma de Spreckels, the founder of the Legion, actually shot M.H. de Young, the owner of the San Francisco Chronicle, in 1884. Fortunately, M.H. de Young lived to tell the tale, and 10 years or so later had the idea of creating a world fair in what is now the music concourse of Golden Gate Park. The goal was to stimulate the local economy, and the fair, which was modeled on other international fairs, had pavilions representing countries from around the world. It also had an art pavilion that was designed in a sort of neo-Egyptian style, relating contemporary arts and crafts to the ancient achievements of one of the oldest civilizations of the world. And as the fair progressed, M.H. de Young acquired works from many of the other pavilions and exhibitors, and those became the core collection of the art museum, then known as the Memorial Museum. Here is M.H. de Young, photographed about 20 years later, after the original pavilion had been greatly expanded by the addition of a large new building designed in the Spanish plateresque style, a style you still see on many of the high-rises in Pacific Heights. And here is an aerial view of that greatly expanded museum dating from about 1920. And you can still see the Egyptian pavilion over on the right side. That was subsequently torn down. The problem with the plateresque decorations on this building was that they fell off. And so in the late 1940s, the decorative elements were stripped away, and what was left was a much more sort of art, a sort of 1920s style, Art Deco style building. And that's how the building looked in 1949. Meanwhile, over in Lincoln Park, Alma de Spreckels had created the Legion of Honor. Alma was a complex and interesting woman who had, in her early life, worked as an artist's model. But she married well in marrying Adolf Spreckels, who had a huge sugar business. And there on the right, we see Alma laying the foundation stone for the Legion of Honor sometime around 1919, 1920. And this building, which was modeled after the Légion d'honneur in Paris, was to house the European art, especially French art, that she had come to love so much in travels to Europe. Here we see the Legion of Honor under construction, and in the foreground, the dusty, the sandy ground, the dunes up on the cliffs, above the cliffs in Lincoln Park. And here we see the inauguration of the Legion in 1924, a reminder that we will be celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Legion in 2024, just as we are now celebrating in this year the 125th anniversary of the de Young. And there is an aerial shot of the Legion taken after its building. An interesting reminder that when the building was created, high on the bluff over the entry to the bay, it was still a relatively bare headland, not as we now know it, with the mature pine trees all around. And I have to say that at the back of my mind is a hope that one day we might open up, as some of those trees naturally age out and die. I have a hope that we might open up some of these vistas. And I would love to see that area in front of the Legion, which is currently a car parking area. I would love to see that reclaimed as a kind of promontory for sculptures. We have to dream big, and that's something for the future. In the course of the 1920s, the 1930s, and the 1940s, the collections of the two museums were built up through the generosity of patrons in the Bay Area. One major acquisition was the gift of paintings and sculptures from the Kress collection, which came to the museum in 1961 and included works by Bronzino, Claude Lorraine, El Greco, one of which we see here, Fra Angelico, and Pieter de Hoek. The two museums had come under the governance of the city in the 1920s, but were still run independently. But in 1972, they finally came under the joint umbrella and were thenceforward known as the Fine Art Museums of San Francisco. And the process began of moving the antiquities and European artworks to the Legion of Honor and concentrating other collections at the de Young, the American collections, the Oceanic collections, the African collections, and the textile collections. A great boost to the strength and collecting of the American collections came with the gift to the de Young in 1979 of a very significant collection of American art that had been formed by John D Rockefeller. The collection included more than 100 paintings, 29 drawings, a couple of sculptures, and was gifted to the de Young because Rockefeller recognized that the de Young was making a real effort to make American art a major focus of its program in the years ahead. And here are just a few of the highlights from that gift. John Singleton Copley's portrait of Mrs. Daniel Sargent on the top right, Bingham's painting of boatmen on the Missouri, and on the right bottom, Marston Hartley's The Summer Camp, Blue Mountain. Well, coming through to more recent times, both museums were very significantly impacted by the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. In the first instance, the de Young was buttressed with huge steel trusses, and over at the Legion, the opportunity was taken to undertake some very dramatic developments that have been under consideration, namely to excavate the courtyard in front of the main part of the building and to create a new and larger exhibition space. And this work was undertaken in the early to mid 1990s, while seismic retrofitting was undertaken through the whole building. And that space is now covered over by the courtyard as we know it today. And the small pyramid, glass pyramid in the center, is a skylight to the exhibition galleries below. Over at the De Young, the innovations had to be even more dramatic. It was recognized quite quickly that the damage done by the earthquake to the original building was really beyond repair. And so the decision was taken to tear down and rebuild the building in entirety. And of course, those of you who were around at the time will recall that this was a fraught political process. There was resistance to the rebuilding of a museum in the park. There was discussion about a possible relocation down to the piers, and everything really was grinding to a halt when Mrs. Wilsey and others in the board leadership really picked up the baton and said, if the city is not going to provide the funding to rebuild the building, we'll raise it privately. And they did, and they were able to secure the original site in Golden Gate Park. And after an architectural competition, the European designers, Herzog and de Meuron, were chosen. And these images show the building under construction, and as we know it today, an extraordinary modernist building in Golden Gate Park that provides a counterpart to the Beaux-Arts building of the Legion of Honor over in Lincoln Park that we see here in the distance, just a couple of miles away on the High Line, on the horizon. So that's a quick summary of the history of the two museums that I feel so honored and proud to have become the director of about a year and a half ago. And since I arrived, I've been working with the staff to think about what we want the museums to be in the future. What should our priorities be, and how can we best address our audiences? As we've gone through this strategic planning process, we've had one eye on what's going on in the world around us. And so I want to spend the next 10 minutes just looking at some of what I think are the main sort of socio-economic, political changes going on in the art world. There are really 6 major issues, I think, that are really impacting us. The first is the way that art and international exhibitions have now become not just a phenomenon of Europe and America. Here we see the Tutankhamun exhibition at the De Young in 2010. This is now a phenomenon that is global, and we are in competition for art and for programming with museums from South America to Africa, to Eastern Europe, to Asia. Here, for example, we see an exhibition about Picasso that took place in Beijing in 2019. The stakes are high, and the prices being paid, especially by Asian museums, are enormous. So this is a real competition for the older European and American museums. We're also in competition with the whole new global tourism effect. Here, for example, we see the new Louvre Museum in Abu Dhabi that is now part of the international tourist circuit for any self-respecting art lover. So this is one major factor, the fact that art is now a global destination tourist competition. A second issue that has really come to the forefront again in the last 20 years is the question of who owns antiquity. The most famous case of this, of course, are the so-called Elgin Marbles at the British Museum that were removed from the Acropolis in Athens in the late 1810s by Lord Elgin, when Athens was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, and the local ruler had very little interest in such objects and whether they were removed by a wealthy English tourist. Within 20 years, Greece had become a nation state again. And one of the first things that the Greeks did was reach out to the British and say, can we have our marbles back? But of course, the British said, no, these now belong to Britain by an act of parliament, and that is irrevocable. And there the argument has remained for the last 200 years. This is just the most famous, but of many, many cases of works of art that were removed from their places of creation during the colonial era by Britain, by France, by Germany, by Belgium, by Italy. In the 20th century, a new form of colonialism came into being in a way through the power of the American dollar, and especially after the Second World War, the huge trade in antiquities, particularly fueled by American collectors and American museums, led to the enormous illegal trade in illegally excavated and illegally exported antiquities, both from Asia and from the Mediterranean basin and from South America in particular. Here we see the famous Euphroneus crater that was acquired by the Metropolitan Museum in the early 1970s, supposedly it had been supposedly in an ancient collection in the Mediterranean, maybe it was Beirut, and of course in no time at all it turned out that this had been dug up within the last 2 years. Thomas Hoving, the then director at the Metropolitan, jokingly called it the hot pot, but it was really more than 2 or 3 decades before public sentiment built up against this sort of opportunistic collecting. And finally, pressure from source countries and academics led museums to totally rethink their collecting policies in the early 2000s. And this was one of many objects that were returned from the Met, from the Getty, from other institutions to Italy and to Greece and to Turkey. And this is an ongoing discussion. Most recently, President Macron's discussions about the return of African antiquities to African nations has led to a whole new front of discussions. Here, for example, are some of the many, many Benin bronzes that were looted by a British expeditionary force from the Edo capital in Benin in 1898 and distributed to museums across the world. And there's now much discussion about the return of such objects to Africa. A third area that has really come to the fore in the last 10 years or so is the question of identity politics and identity in art. Here we see a slide taken at the Whitney Biennale in 2017. And the painting in the background is a work by the artist Dana Schutz, who had copied in a semi-abstract way a photograph of a 14-year-old African-American called Emmett Till, who had been murdered in Mississippi in 1955, supposedly for flirting with a white woman, and he had been killed, and his mother had his body photographed in the funeral casket as a shocking reminder to the world of this terrible ongoing behavior. And Dana Schutz felt the painting was an appropriate image for her to use in this very powerful work. But at the time it was exhibited, many felt that it was an appropriation of others' suffering. And here we see a photograph of a 24-year-old African-American artist called Parker Bright, standing in protest in front of that painting with on his back the words "Black Death Spectacle." This is, I think, just one of a large number of incidents in the last 5 years or so where there has been considerable public debate about the meaning, deeper meaning of art. Another huge discussion, you'll recall, centered on the monuments to Confederate generals and heroes in southern states. Here we see one of the monuments in Durham, North Carolina, that had been toppled in protests after the murder of an anti-racist activist in Charlottesville shortly before. So this third area, the discussion about the deeper meaning of art, is, I think, a very meaningful one, and one that we very much need to be involved with. The fourth area that is really, of course, has changed the entire world, but is certainly changing the museum world very dramatically, is the development of the whole digital realm. On the positive side, the websites and digital information allow us to take the mission of our museums way beyond the walls of the museum. Here, for example, is one page from the tens of thousands of pages of the Timeline of Art History, which is an online art encyclopedia that was developed at the Metropolitan Museum over the last 25 years, and is probably one of the best online art resources on the website. But the flip side of the digital realm in museums is the kind of changing behaviors that come with it. It's not all bad, but it's not necessarily all good. We've all become, selfie, this is a selfie world. People want to take photographs of themselves with works of art. Some feel that that's a bad thing. Some feel that it's a distraction. I'm more benign. I feel that if people take images of works of art and look at them afterwards and share them with their friends, it's part of a process of engaging with art. But certainly the herd-like behavior that we see, for example, here at the Louvre can be pretty off-putting. Another aspect of this selfie generation is the success of experiential works of art. Many of our younger visitors want a museum experience, to be experiential, to be with their friends. And artists like Yayoi Kusama, with her infinity rooms, have become almost a sort of a new trope. Experiential installations are a great crowd pleaser for many contemporary museums. And we're all experimenting on where this will go next with artificial reality and virtual reality. And of course, some of you will have seen the fascinating exhibition that our curator, Claudia Schmuckli, had just opened at the De Young on the theme of artificial intelligence. And I hope that some of you will be able to come and visit that when we open to the public, whenever that will be. This is an image of an immersive Van Gogh experience in Beijing. And I'm sure we'll see a lot more of these in the future. Indeed, the Asian Art Museum has a huge immersive experience slated for when they reopen their new wing later this fall. Another disruptive factor in the fifth of the six I'm going to mention in the art world is the crazy prices that are resulting from the huge investment in art by speculators. And where in the 1970s it was brownwood furniture and old master paintings that fetched the top prices, and where in the 1980s and the 1990s it was impressionist paintings, really since the early 2000s, the focus has shifted to modern and contemporary art. And with investment coming from from around the globe, we've seen higher and higher prices. $91 million here for a Jeff Koons rabbit, $170 million here for a Modigliani nude that was acquired by a Chinese billionaire and will be one of a number of artworks that he hopes to use to attract visitors to his new museum in Shanghai. And of course, the highest price of all was the $450 million paid for the Salvator Mundi painting attributed to Leonardo da Vinci. This is a work that the old master experts had been pretty quizzical about. When this was offered to me at the Metropolitan Museum, my head of European paintings said he wouldn't pay $20,000 for it, although he might accept it as a gift. But the painting was the subject of intensive conservation and huge speculation, and it was ultimately sold in a contemporary art sale and appealed to the collectors who want trophy art. So just another example of the way that this investment in trophy art collecting is impacting the market, and of course, driving much art way beyond the resources of museums with our relatively small acquisition funds. The sixth and the last factor I want to take a quick look at that is changing, really impacting the museum world, is the changing nature of philanthropy. So many of the museums across America were founded by visionary members of the leading philanthropists in cities across the country. People like Almeda Spreckels, like M.H. de Young, who really believed in giving back and investing in the local community. Here I show a photograph of Jane Reitsma, one of the great supporters of the Metropolitan Museum, who gave literally hundreds of millions of dollars worth of art to the Metropolitan Museum over the last 40 years. And here I show a familiar face, Mrs. Willsey, who locally has played such a critical role in supporting the art and culture of San Francisco. And I know that in speaking to you, many of you are equally involved in supporting cultural institutions in the Bay Area. The big question is, where is the next generation? Here in the Bay, we have so much wealth being made in technology, but relatively few of the billionaires who are being newly minted in the tech industry and in venture capital are yet supporting the arts and culture in their philanthropy. Much more often it's medicine, it's the environment, maybe education, but it's not much of it is coming to the artistic sector. And indeed, there are some very influential figures. Here we see Bill Gates, who have really set a direction away from the cultural sector. Back in 2011, I was taken aback to hear Mr. Gates saying that he felt it was wrong for people to give money to cultural institutions if instead they could be giving money to stop children going blind. And it will come as no surprise to you to hear me saying that I don't think it's a zero-sum game. There is a great deal of wealth available to support all sorts of different causes, and blindness, a terrible physical affliction, is also not just physical, because cultural blindness is at the root of so much misunderstanding in the world today. And I feel that museums play a critical role in helping to break down cultural blindness, to help people understand the history and the cultures of their own people, but also to understand the history and cultures of other people. So I feel that our mission, our educational mission, is even more important in this divided and polarized world today, as when institutions like the De Young and like the Legion were established 100 years ago. So where does that, let's come back to the present. If I can move my slide forward. Here we go. Here we have the Legion of Honor in a recent photograph with the Golden Gate Bridge beyond. As I said, we've been thinking hard about the future of our two museums, and even as we shelter in place, we have a number of task forces working, thinking about the identity of the museums. With the Legion, we're thinking about how we can build on the strengths of our antiquity collections and our European collections from between the Middle Ages all the way through to the early 20th century, and how we can really position the Legion as a sort of Frick of the West Coast, a place that is known for the quality of its collections and for the quality of its scholarship. We need to think about how we can build on the strengths, everything from Fra Angelico to Rembrandt and Rubens to Monet and Rodin, and also our huge drawings and prints collection, the Achenbach Collection. How we can think of fresh ways to make these collections compelling and engaging, both for existing audiences and for new audiences. Sometimes it'll be an intervention with contemporary art, as we see there with the Urs Fischer installation a couple of years ago. But it will also be through a renewed commitment to education and scholarship. Here we see Melissa Buron, who recently organized the wonderful Tissot exhibition, lecturing about the scholarship, really the lifetime's passion that went into the creation of that great exhibition. I think we've all had that experience of looking at a work of art and maybe enjoying it, but maybe not looking twice. And then when the curator begins to talk to you about it, you see it with entirely new eyes. And I think that whether it's physically in the galleries or remotely through digital, that is something I really want to invest in and make sure that we have a very active program of talks and lectures and interventions. And we'll keep buying. We'll keep buying when we can afford. For example, this beautiful empire-style bed that was made for the very important French patron Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, made in the early 1800s, and which we recently acquired for the Legion of Honor. And in a similar way, over at the De Young, we will continue to invest in the strengths of our American collections that embrace art from Mesoamerica, from Native American art, colonial American art, and modern and contemporary, along with our great oceanic and African collections and our textile collections. We will build up the museum so that people recognize that this is a leading center of research and scholarship in all of these areas, a must-visit destination for both national and international tourists, but also a hub of activity for the local community. And we'll continue to build the collections again as and when we can afford to do so. Here is a wonderful recent acquisition by the artist Frank Bowling, one who was born in Guyana, then worked and lived in London and New York. This is one of his map series titled Penumbra, dating from 1970, part of a series that challenged the colonial and imperialistic mentality of mapping. And in his maps, he explores the themes of diaspora, the slave trade, and the way that colonial powers, the thinking of colonial powers has shaped the world as we know it. And I think these are the sorts of works of art, the questions that we need to be bringing to our collections. They're not just art. So many of these objects were made in particular contexts, and the process of collecting them and putting them in museums, while absolutely valid in terms of scholarship and sociological study, is always in part inflected by the prejudices of the generation that acquires them and presents them. And the opportunity for us is to step back and try and bring new objectivity to our collections and to unearth the narratives that might have been repressed or not covered. Works by Native American artists, African American artists, women artists that have not been in the spotlight. That for me was one of the great pleasures of organizing the Soul of a Nation exhibition that many of you will have seen here recently, a show that put the spotlight on a group of African American artists and the works they created between 1963 and 1983 during the civil rights era. a group of artists that have been overlooked by the art world, but are now finally receiving their due. And we must think creatively about how we engage with our audiences. We have the most wonderful docent group, college of experts, who give the most tremendous tours through our exhibitions. But we also need to think about how we bring in other voices. So for example, in the Soul of a Nation exhibition, we had community representatives, young students, who also brought in fresh perspectives. And in terms of community engagement, another initiative that I've been very delighted by over the last year has been the Free Saturday initiative that has brought in new visitors, people who had not felt welcome or comfortable at the museum. We've seen attendance doubling at both the Legion and at the De Young. Many more families, many younger people, and a much more diverse audience. So that's an initiative we are very pleased with and that we'll continue to invest in. Fundamentally, our mission is about education. It's about bringing people in front of works of art and stimulating their curiosity, whether they come through our K-12 program, through the school program, or whether they are lifelong learners. Clearly, as a result of COVID-19, we're going to have to think very creatively especially about engagement with the vulnerable population, many of whom may be cautious about coming back to the museums anytime soon. But I think that we'll work hard to experiment with digital, and the very fact that I'm giving this online broadcast now is just one manifestation of the sorts of experiments that I think will be going on, so that we will both be live and analog in the galleries, but for those of you who hesitate to come back, we'll also be online and streaming in wherever we can reach you. So the museum from home will be a critical part of our future. For now, let me finish with a reminder that we are obviously seriously impacted during this period of closure. We're a museum that is very reliant on earned revenue through our admissions and through our membership program. And those of you who are members and donors, I can just humbly ask you to renew quickly and to consider making a donation to our recovery fund. My top priority is to keep the museum's staff, wonderful staff, in place so that when we can reopen, we can be up and running quickly to serve our audiences, and so that in the meantime, we can continue to do everything we can digitally to connect with you. And I'm just going to finish by telling you briefly about one of the exhibitions that we are currently organizing, recognizing that there's been a whole move around. We've had to delay some exhibitions and cancel others. We have taken the opportunity to advance an idea we've been thinking about for later in the year. And this is an open invitational exhibition to artists living in the Bay Area to create works of art that will be juried in June. And then just as soon as the museum can open, we'll hang the art salon style, wall to wall, edge to edge, higgledy-piggledy. Hopefully it will be creative, a bit chaotic, but it will be a great way of celebrating the creativity here in the Bay Area. And the artists will be able to sell their works and keep 100% of the proceeds. So we'll both be celebrating the Bay creativity, but I hope also helping to support it in a little way. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. I very much look forward to seeing you back here as soon as we can reopen. That Frida Kahlo show is there waiting for you. And in the meantime, stay well, stay healthy. I hope I send my best to you and to all your families. Thank you very much for listening. And I think we now have time for a few questions that Karen Huang will be working with me. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tom, for that insightful presentation. It's definitely brought up a lot of topics for further thought and discussion. So we have time for just a few questions. And thank you for the supporters that submitted in advance. And one question, I think on many people's mind, just further elaborate on your fourth point in the digital realm is, with the crisis, do you see a focus shifted to more digital exhibits? And do you think exhibition design will be affected? For example, directing how the flow of traffic or how we present art?
Well, I think the safety of our staff and our visitors is, of course, our top priority. So I've set up a task force that is looking at what any sort of reopening will look like, both behind the scenes to make sure that our staff can remain well and healthy, and then front of house, how our visitors can come back to the museum and also have the confidence that they are in a clean and safe space. And we'll be working very closely with the city to make sure that we follow all the appropriate protocols. My thought, I think, on this is that because museums are large and spacious buildings, it is possible for people to physically distance within them. So I'm confident that we will be able to reopen before too long, and that following protocols, wearing masks, physically distancing, having time tickets, and having very heightened cleaning regimes, we will be able to provide that safe environment for our staff and for our visitors. And in the meantime, we are busy experimenting in the digital realm, both finding content that we have already created in the past and rapidly pivoting to creating new content today and into the future. And I'm very interested in the museums as a place of lifelong learning. And so I think this really is making me and my colleagues think hard about how we move quickly in that virtual realm, and how we can capture lectures and capture performances in ways that especially the vulnerable population can safely view from home. So I'm sure this is going to be a very high priority in the coming months.
Great. And I would like to just add one question for individuals who are very interested in care for the works, that the exhibitions that were closing around the time we had to go into shelter in place, specifically TISO and Soul the Nation. I think people were interested in were the objects being able to go back to their homes safely.
Well, the Tissot show went from the Legion to the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and it had been safely installed when the shelter in place went into operation in Paris. And like our Frida Kahlo show, those paintings are now hanging in empty galleries. And we very much hope that when Paris begins to get back to, well, it won't be normal, but to a post-COVID ramp up, that show will still be viewable by the Paris audience. Here in San Francisco, as I've mentioned, we had the Frida Kahlo show is installed, and the Soul of a Nation show is in the process of deinstallation. And when our staff are able to come back to work, we will finish the packing of that show and it will head on to its final venue in Houston.
All right, thank you. I think that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you, Tom, for taking us back in time and reflecting on our two beloved museums, especially giving us an opportunity to celebrate the DeYoung anniversary a little bit. And for those of you who are interested in more history on the DeYoung, we have a really terrific timeline on Google Arts and Culture, so I encourage you to browse that as well. Thank you for everyone for joining us, for your support and dedication to our museums. And if you enjoyed this program, definitely give us a, send us an email from the special events email just to let us know if you've enjoyed this and other types of program you might like to see. So with that, I'll just turn over back to Tom for any closing remarks.
No, I just say thank you very much for joining us. And yes, let us know, this is an experiment. So let us know what you think works and of course what you think doesn't work. And with that, again, stay safe and well. And I look forward to seeing you in person later in the year when we are able to reopen. Thank you very much.